In the sixth and seventh chapters of the first essay, Malthus takes us on a brief world tour designed to show how different conditions give greater or less scope to the power of population. In every situation, though, he insists that each population always grows up to whatever limit is imposed in each particular time and place. In the process, he proves again that he is a populationist who believes that population growth and size show the merit and civilization level of a society. When discussing examples of Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English colonies established in other parts of the world, he finds various faults in all the non-English colonies. The Spanish and Portuguese colonists suffer under tyranny, superstition, unfair taxes, and restrictions on trade. The French and Dutch are even worse.
The Dutch and French colonies, though under the government of exclusive companies of merchants, which Dr. Adam Smith says very justly is the worst of all possible governments, still persisted in thriving under every disadvantage.
Population grew quickly in all of these colonies despite such problems because they had not yet reached the limit of their food supply. Of course, Malthus judges the English colonies to be superior to any other. His gauge of this superiority is simply the fact that their populations grow faster than any other colonies. All the colonies had plenty of good land, but the English colonies had a greater degree of liberty and equality, so they grew faster. This is exactly the same recipe for the virtue nutritive proposed by Botero, another populationist, a century or two earlier. There is no question that Malthus also judges this superior rate of growth as a reliable indicator of moral superiority and a higher level of civilization. But even the most virtuous civilization will eventually reach its limits.
Whatever was the original number of British emigrants that increased so fast in the North American colonies, let us ask, why does not an equal number produce an equal increase in the same time in Great Britain? The great and obvious cause to be assigned is the want of room and food, or, in other words, misery.
Almost as an afterthought to this point about rapid growth of colonies as a mark of virtue and superiority, Malthus then adds several examples of old established states with stable populations where natural disasters, wars, or plagues suddenly wiped out a fraction of that population. In each case, he draws on demographic evidence that was available to him even at this early date. In every case, just as when a population is reduced by immigration, he sees the same result.
Even old states recover the desolations of war, pestilence, or the accidents of nature. They are then for a short time placed a little in the situation of new states, and the invariable consequence will be that population which before perhaps was nearly stationary will begin immediately to increase.
Malthus even comes back to this ability of any population to recover from temporary demographic losses in his final chapters, where he cites this restorative tendency as one more proof that the power of population to increase is a God-given blessing rather than any kind of evil force. But in this seventh chapter, we also encounter a riddle or contradiction in the logical framework that Malthus is building. He does not even seem to be aware of the contradiction in this first essay, and so of course he doesn't resolve it. In the course of describing variations in the population from one country to another, he is forced to recognize that the same supply of food does not always translate into the same size of population. It is one thing to say that different levels of civilization allow one society to support only a thinly settled population with a hunter-gatherer form of subsistence, while another society with organized agriculture can support a larger, densely settled population. All this means is that one form of society produces more food than the other, so it ends up with more people. This kind of comparison actually assumes that each person in any population needs pretty much the same amount of food as any other person in any other population. Only if this resources per person ratio is something like a biological constant across human societies can we translate more subsistence into larger populations and less subsistence into sparser populations. In fact, this resources per person constant is actually the reason why, after a war or a plague, the population will increase back up to its old limit again. But without seeming to notice it, Malthus then proceeds to show that the resources per person ratio is not a constant at all across different societies. His first example involves the very low resources per person ratio in China and how he thinks things got that way.
In some countries, population appears to have been forced. That is, the people have been habituated by degrees to live almost upon the smallest possible quantity of food. There must have been periods in such countries when the population increased permanently without an increase in the means of subsistence. China seems to answer to this description.
If it was possible for the population to increase and still to survive permanently on the existing means of subsistence, obviously that population did not start out at the lowest possible amount of subsistence. They had to start out at some level that provided more resources per person than the minimum required for survival, or the forced population growth would not have been possible. But the constant pressure of population on resources should never allow this higher level of resources per person to happen. If population always presses continuously upon the means of subsistence, as Malthus insists over and over again, how did China ever get ahead of the game in the first place so that there was a level of subsistence greater than that needed for survival? This example by itself doesn't have to worry us too much because we could just say China has always suffered with that small amount of resources per person. The forced population scenario imagined by Malthus might never have happened, and his basic theory would still be fine. More disturbingly, though, a couple of paragraphs later in chapter 7, Malthus expands this mystery of variations in the resources per person ratio.
In the different states of Europe, there must be some variations in the proportion between the number of inhabitants and the quantity of food consumed, arising from the different habits of living that prevail in each state. The labourers in the south of England are so accustomed to eat fine wheaten bread that they will suffer themselves to be half-starved before they will submit to live like the Scottish peasants. They might perhaps, in time, by the constant operation of the hard law of necessity, be reduced to live even like the lower Chinese, and the country would then, with the same quantity of food, support a greater population.
But if population always presses against the means of subsistence, how could such variations in the resources per person ratio arise in the first place? What happened to the hard law of necessity he talks about while these different habits of living came into existence? How could the workers in the south of England, as Malthus described them, ever become accustomed to eating fine wheaten bread? Something at some time must have caused just the opposite of what Malthus described in his example of China. In the most advanced European states, there must have been periods when the means of subsistence improved permanently without an increase in the population. This clearly violates his assumption about population pressing continuously on the means of subsistence. Yet he declares that such variations in the resources per person ratio exist. He never even seems to notice this contradiction. And if he had noticed it, the assumptions and logic that guided his writing of this first essay in 1798 would not have offered him any solution. The closest he comes to offering an excuse for variations in the proportion between the number of inhabitants and the quantity of food is an ad hoc reference near the end of chapter 7 to invasion by outside groups.
Were a country never to be overrun by a people more advanced in arts, but left to its own progress in civilization, during the lapse of many hundreds of years there would not be a single period when the mass of the people could be said to be free from distress, either directly or indirectly, for the want of food.
Explaining a higher standard of living as something imposed by outside conquerors solves nothing, of course, because we have no explanation for how these conquerors ever managed to rise above the pressure of population on the means of subsistence and to become more advanced in arts. All of humanity should be struggling along on the edge of survival with the food per person ratio everywhere driven down to the lowest common denominator by the pressure of population. The riddle is only shifted from one society to another. The solution to this contradiction only emerges several years later, after his thinking evolved and matured, and after he revised and extended the first essay.